the night of October 14th, 1944, somewhere along the Gothic line in northern Italy, temperature dropping to near freezing. Private James Thornton crouched in a hastily dug foxhole, his breath visible in the thin moonlight, listening to the distant rumble of German artillery, preparing for what intelligence predicted would be a major counterattack. Around him, men from a 92nd Infantry Division settled into defensive positions along a ridgeline that overlooked a crucial supply route. The stakes were clear: hold this position or risk losing weeks of hard-fought gains. But Thornton wasn't thinking about grand strategy or divisional objectives. His mind was fixated on a problem that had plagued him since basic training, a frustration that had cost him accuracy, confidence, and the respect of his fellow soldiers. His rifle sight wobbled. Every single time he tried to line up a shot beyond 300 meters, the rear aperture shifted just enough to throw off his aim. It was a manufacturing defect, common in the mass-produced M1 Garand rifles that had flooded the front lines. But officially, there was no field remedy. Armorers told him to deal with it. Officers told him to aim lower and pray. His squad mates told him he was just a lousy shot. James Thornton had grown up in rural Montana, the son of a blacksmith and a schoolteacher, in a town where the nearest neighbor was 3 miles away, and survival often meant improvisation. By age 10, he could repair a broken plow, fashion a hinge from scrap metal, and jury-rig a water pump using wire and instinct. His father had taught him that when something didn't work, you didn't complain, you fixed it. The family's livelihood depended on that philosophy. When a piece of farm equipment broke during harvest season, there was no time to order parts from the city or wait for a traveling repairman. You made do with what you had, or you lost the crop. James absorbed those lessons deeply. He learned to look at broken things not as permanent failures, but as puzzles waiting to be solved. His father would often set challenges for him, deliberately sabotaging tools or machinery and asking James to figure out what was wrong and how to fix it with limited resources. By the time he was 15, James could diagnose mechanical problems faster than most adult farmhands, and his solutions, while unconventional, almost always worked. When James enlisted in early 1943, that mindset came with him. But the Army wasn't interested in improvisation. The Army wanted discipline, conformity, and adherence to doctrine. When Thornton first mentioned his rifle sight problem to his drill instructor at Camp Roberts, the response was swift and dismissive. Use your weapon as issued, private. No modifications. No exceptions. The instructor, a career soldier named Sergeant Major Herbert Grant, had served in World War I and held deep-seated beliefs about military order and the chain of command. He had seen too many soldiers injure themselves or others by tinkering with weapons they didn't fully understand. His response to Thornton was informed by decades of experience, but it left no room for individual problem-solving. So Thornton kept quiet. He qualified as marksman, barely, missing the sharpshooter threshold by 3 points, a failure that gnawed at him because he knew, absolutely knew, that with a stable sight, he could outshoot half the men in his platoon. During qualifications, he had watched other recruits, men with far less shooting experience than him, score higher simply because their rifles functioned properly. The injustice of it burned in his chest, but he said nothing. After basic training, Thornton was assigned to the 92nd Infantry Division, one of only 2 African-American infantry divisions to see combat in Europe during World War II. The division faced unique challenges beyond the normal hardships of war. They operated under white officers, many of whom harbored prejudices that affected unit cohesion and leadership decisions. They were often given the most difficult terrain to hold, with inadequate support and outdated equipment. Thornton, despite his Montana upbringing in a predominantly white community, found himself part of a unit where racial dynamics complicated every aspect of military life. But on the line, under fire, those complications faded into background noise. What mattered was whether you could shoot straight, carry your weight, and keep your head when artillery started falling. Thornton's rifle sight problem, which might have been addressed quickly in another unit with better supply lines and more attentive armorers, languished unresolved for months. Now, in Italy, 9 months into his deployment, that unresolved problem had become a matter of life and death. The German forces were dug in across a valley floor, occupying stone farmhouses and reinforced bunkers, and American intelligence indicated they were massing for a major push to retake the ridgeline. The position was strategically vital. Lose it, and the Germans would control the supply route that fed 3 Allied divisions pushing north toward the Po Valley. Long-range rifle fire would be critical during the defense. Machine gun nests could provide suppressing fire, but picking off officers, radio operators, and forward observers required precision marksmanship at distances exceeding 500 meters. These targets were force multipliers. Kill an officer, and you disrupted command and control. Take out a radio operator, and you sever communication links. Drop a forward observer, and you blinded enemy artillery. These were high-value targets, and they required shooters who could deliver accurate fire at extreme range. Thornton's company commander, Captain Andrew Hollis, had called for volunteers to serve as designated marksmen during the coming engagement. Hollis was a West Point graduate, a by-the-book officer who valued discipline and proper procedure, but he also recognized that doctrine didn't always account for battlefield realities. He had seen enough combat to know that sometimes you needed soldiers who could think creatively and take initiative. When Thornton raised his hand to volunteer, Hollis saw the determination in his eyes, but also noticed the skeptical looks from other soldiers. Sergeant Eddie Caldwell, Thornton's squad leader and a gruff Texan who had seen Thornton miss easy shots during live-fire exercises, pulled him aside after the briefing. "Thornton, you sure about this? We need shooters who can hit what they aim at, not guys who spray rounds downrange and hope for the best. This isn't target practice. Every round counts." Thornton met his gaze steadily. "I can do it, Sarge. Just give me a chance. I know what the problem is, and I know how to fix it." Caldwell studied him for a long moment, weighing the request. He had seen plenty of soldiers overestimate their abilities, especially when nerves and adrenaline took over. But there was something different about Thornton, a quiet confidence that didn't seem like bravado. Finally, Caldwell sighed. "All right, but if you screw this up, you're back on ammo detail for the rest of the month." And I mean that. That afternoon, with the sun sinking behind the Apennine peaks and casting long shadows across the valley, Thornton sat alone in his foxhole, his rifle disassembled on a canvas tarp, and stared at the rear sight assembly. The problem was mechanical, not a matter of skill or technique. The aperture, a small disc with a peephole at the shooter, looked through to align with the front sight post, was held in place by a worn spring and a loose dovetail joint. Every time the rifle fired, the recoil jostled the aperture just slightly, maybe a fraction of a millimeter, but enough to shift the point of impact by several inches at long range. Standard Army doctrine offered no solution. Replacement parts were scarce, rationed for priority repairs, and even if he could get a new rear sight assembly, there was no guarantee it wouldn't have the same defect. The manufacturing tolerances on wartime production rifles were notoriously inconsistent. Thornton needed something else, something simple, something that wouldn't require tools or parts he didn't have, something that could be implemented immediately. He rummaged through his pack and found a bent nail, salvaged weeks earlier from a destroyed barn near Lucca. It was rusty, crooked, about 3 inches long, and entirely unremarkable. Thornton had picked it up without any particular purpose in mind, simply following his father's old advice: always carry spare metal. You never know when you'll need it. Now, as Thornton turned the nail over in his hands, an idea began to form. What if he could use a nail to wedge the aperture assembly into a fixed position, eliminating the wobble entirely? It would mean losing the ability to adjust the sight for different ranges, sacrificing the graduated aperture settings designed for 200, 300, 400-meter engagements. But Thornton had already memorized the holdover points for his rifle at various distances. He had spent countless hours during lulls in combat testing his rifle's trajectory, shooting at rocks and tree stumps at measured distances, building an intuitive sense of where the bullet would strike relative to his point of aim. If he could stabilize the sight at a fixed zero, say 400 meters, he could compensate manually for longer or shorter shots by adjusting his aim point. It was unorthodox. It violated regulations, and it might just work. He heated the nail over a small fire, built from scraps of wood, and shielded from observation by the walls of his foxhole until the metal glowed dull red and became pliable. Then, Using 2 flat rocks as makeshift tools, he carefully bent the nail into a tight U shape, creating a wedge that would fit snugly into the gap between the aperture disc and the base of the sight housing. The process required precision. Too loose, and the nail would fall out under recoil. Too tight, and he might crack the sight housing or permanently deform the aperture. He worked slowly, testing the fit multiple times, adjusting the angle of the bend until the nail seated perfectly. Using his bayonet as a makeshift screwdriver and punch, he pried open the rear sight housing just enough to slip the bent nail into position, then tapped it gently with the butt of his knife until it wedged firmly into place. He reassembled the rifle, checked the sight picture, and tested the aperture with his thumb. No wobble. The aperture was rock solid, locked in position by nothing more than a bent nail and careful fitting. Thornton allowed himself a grim smile, but he knew the real test would come under firing conditions. He scrounged for rounds from his ammunition supply, rounds he could ill afford to waste, and moved to a quiet section of the perimeter where he could fire without drawing attention. He found a German helmet, abandoned during an earlier skirmish, sitting on a rock outcropping approximately 380 meters downrange. He estimated the distance using a method his father had taught him, counting paces to a reference point, and then using angular measurement with his thumb. He settled into a prone position, controlled his breathing, aligned the sight picture, and squeezed a trigger. The rifle cracked. 380 meters away, the helmet flew off the rock. Thornton felt a surge of satisfaction. He fired 3 more shots at various targets: a tree stump at 450 meters, a section of stone wall at 520 meters, a wooden post at 300 meters. Every shot landed exactly where he aimed. The modification worked. The sight was stable. For the first time since he had been issued this rifle, Thornton felt complete confidence in his weapon. As dusk settled over the ridgeline, Thornton moved to an observation post about 50 meters forward of the main defensive line, a shallow trench overlooking the valley. Captain Hollis had designated this position for a forward marksman, soldiers who would engage high-value targets during the expected German attack. The position offered a clear line of sight to a cluster of farmhouses roughly 600 meters away, where German troops were visible moving supplies and setting up firing positions. Thornton settled into a prone position, his rifle resting on a sandbag filled with dirt and small rocks, and began to range the targets. He picked a German soldier carrying a crate of ammunition, estimated the distance at 590 meters, adjusted his aim to account for a bullet drop and the slight crosswind blowing from left to right, and squeezed the trigger. The rifle cracked. 600 meters away, the soldier dropped. For a moment, Thornton wasn't sure if he'd hit or if the man had simply taken cover. Then he saw other German soldiers scrambling, dragging the body behind a stone wall, shouting and pointing toward the American lines. Thornton exhaled slowly. It had worked. He chambered another round, the satisfying metallic clack of the M1 Garand's action, and scanned for another target. Over the next 30 minutes, as twilight deepened into night, Thornton systematically engaged German personnel moving in and out of the farmhouse complex. A soldier adjusting a mortar, an officer consulting a map, a radio operator setting up an antenna. Each shot carefully aimed, each trigger pulled smooth and deliberate, each hit confirmed by the reactions of other German soldiers. Word of Thornton's shooting spread quickly through the defensive positions. Soldiers who had dismissed him as a marginal rifleman now watched in stunned silence as he methodically picked off German soldiers at distances that should have been impossible for standard infantry rifles equipped with iron sights. By the time full darkness fell, Thornton had registered 9 confirmed hits, including 2 at ranges exceeding 650 meters. Sergeant Caldwell crawled up to the observation post, moving low to avoid silhouetting himself against the sky, his face a mixture of disbelief and admiration. "Thornton, what the hell did you do to that rifle? I just watched you drop a crowd at damn near 700 meters, with iron sights, and failing light. How?" Thornton showed him the bent nail, explaining the modification in simple terms. Caldwell stared at it, then at Thornton, then back at the nail. "You wedged a goddamn nail in your sight? That's it? That's the big secret?" Thornton shrugged. "It stabilizes the aperture, eliminates the wobble. I can't adjust for range anymore, but I don't need to. I know where the rounds go at every distance. Caldwell shook his head slowly, a grin spreading across his weathered face. You're either a genius or completely insane. Maybe both. Probably both. Does Captain Hollis know about this? Thornton shook his head. Not yet. Figured I'd wait and see if it worked before I said anything. Caldwell laughed quietly. Well, it sure has. Hell works. Keep doing what you're doing. And when this is over, you're going to show every man in this company how you did that. The German counterattack came just after midnight. Artillery fire hammered the American positions for 20 minutes, a deafening barrage that sent men diving for cover and turned the ridgeline into a maelstrom of exploding earth and shrapnel. Shells screamed overhead, impacting with bone-shaking concussions that collapsed foxholes and shredded sandbags. The bombardment was intense but poorly targeted, a sign that German forward observers lacked accurate intelligence on American positions. When the shelling stopped, the sudden silence was almost as unnerving as the noise. Then came the sound every infantryman dreaded. The mechanical clatter of German MG-42 machine guns opening fire, their distinctive high-rate buzz-saw sound cutting through the darkness. The Germans were advancing across the valley floor, moving in squad-sized elements. Try to reach the base of the ridgeline before American defenders could regroup and establish effective fields of fire. It was precisely the kind of chaotic night engagement where long-range rifle fire could make the difference between holding the line and being overrun. Thornton, back in his observation post, peered through the darkness, relying on muzzle flashes and the faint silhouettes of moving figures to identify targets. The bent nail modification had given him pinpoint accuracy at range during daylight, but now he faced a new challenge: shooting in near total darkness at moving targets whose exact distances were difficult to judge. He slowed his breathing, forcing himself into a state of cold focus, the kind his father had taught him when hunting elk in the Montana wilderness during winter months when visibility was measured in feet, not yards. Wait for the moment. Trust your instincts. Don't rush the shot. Let the target present itself. A German machine gun team set a position near a low stone wall about 550 meters out. Thornton could see the faint outline of the gunner adjusting the tripod, the assistant gunner feeding an ammunition belt. The MG-42 was a devastating weapon, capable of firing over 1,000 rounds per minute, and if that gun opened up on the American positions, it would pin down an entire platoon. Thornton aimed, accounting for the slight downward angle in the crosswind he measured earlier using a piece of thread tied to his rifle barrel. He fired. The gunner collapsed. The assistant gunner, partially hidden behind the wall, tried to take over, sliding into position behind the weapon. Thornton worked the bolt, chambered another round, adjusted his aim point slightly to account for the new target's position, and fired again. Another hit. The machine gun fell silent. The third member of the gun crew, the ammunition bearer, abandoned the weapon and ran. Thornton let him go. One terrified soldier spreading panic was worth more than one dead body. Around him, other American soldiers were firing, the distinctive sound of M1 Garands and Browning automatic rifles creating a symphony of overlapping cracks and chatters, but most of their shots were going wide or falling short in the darkness. They were firing at muzzle flashes, at sounds, at shadows, hoping to hit something but lacking precision to consistently neutralize targets. Thornton's rifle, stabilized by that bent nail and guided by his intimate knowledge of the weapon's trajectory, was delivering precision fire that disrupted German formations and prevented them from massing for a concentrated assault. Every shot mattered. Every target eliminated reduced the pressure on American positions. Thornton worked methodically, scanning for high-value targets, engaging, moving slightly to avoid counterfire, then resuming his position. At one point during the night, a German officer, identifiable by the way other soldiers deferred to him and by the pistol holster visible on his belt, appeared near a cluster of trees about 600 meters downrange. He was coordinating movements, pointing and shouting orders that Thornton couldn't hear but could clearly see. Officers were always priority targets. They carried maps, knew objectives, made tactical decisions. Kill the officer, and you decapitated local command. The soldiers under his command would hesitate, lose coordination, fall back on default training, instead of adapting to battlefield conditions. Thornton tracked him through his sight, waiting for a moment of stillness. The officer paused, gesturing emphatically toward the American positions, his body language suggesting frustration. Thornton exhaled, held half a breath, and squeezed the trigger. The officer went down. The German soldiers around him scattered, their coordinated assault dissolving into confusion. Some dropped prone. Others retreated toward the farmhouses. A few fired wildly in the direction they thought the shot had come from, but none came close to Thornton's position. By dawn, the German counterattack had stalled. American casualties were lighter than expected, and the ridgeline remained firmly in Allied hands. When the sun rose over the valley, revealing the scattered bodies of German soldiers who had tried and failed to dislodge the defenders, Thornton's squad mates gathered around him, slapping his back and shaking his hand. Word spread through the entire company. The guy with the bent nail had saved their asses. Soldiers who hadn't even seen Thornton shoot heard the stories from those who had, tales that grew slightly more dramatic with each retelling, but maintained a core of undeniable truth. Thornton had made impossible shots in impossible conditions and had single-handedly disrupted an enemy assault. Captain Andrew Hollis, the company commander, summoned Thornton to his command post later that morning. Hollis was exhausted, his uniform dirty and torn, his eyes red from lack of sleep, but he wanted answers. "Thornton, I've been hearing stories all morning about your shooting last night. Sergeant Caldwell tells me you made modifications to your rifle." "Show me." Thornton presented his rifle and explained the bent nail modification, demonstrating how it stabilized the sight and walking Hollis through mechanical principles. Hollis studied the modification carefully, testing the sight aperture himself, then looked at Thornton with an expression that mixed respect and mild exasperation. "Private, you do realize that modifying your weapon without authorization is a court-martial offense?" Thornton stiffened. "Yes, sir. I know, sir. But my sight was defective, and I needed it to work." Hollis let the moment hang, then waved his hand dismissively. "Relax, Thornton. I'm not court-martialing you. I'm promoting you. And then I'm putting you in charge of training every shooter in this company how to make that same modification. How many other rifles have the same problem?" Thornton hesitated, then answered honestly. "At least a dozen, sir. Maybe more. I've heard other men complaining about sight wobble, but nobody knew what to do about it." Hollis nodded thoughtfully. "This is a kind of field ingenuity that wins wars, Private. Or should I say corporal. As of this moment, you're promoted. Now get with the armors and show them your fix. If it works as well as you say, and based on what I saw last night, I have no doubt it does, we're going to implement it across the battalion. Maybe the regiment." Thornton felt a surge of pride, but kept his expression neutral. "Yes, sir. Thank you, sir." Hollis dismissed him, then called him back. "One more thing, Thornton. Don't ever let anyone tell you that following doctrine is more important than solving problems. Doctrine is a guideline. Reality is what we deal with. You dealt with reality, and you saved lives. Remember that." Within a week, the bent nail trick had spread throughout the regiment. Armorers began fabricating small metal wedges based on Thornton's improvised design, using scrap metal from destroyed equipment and damaged vehicles. They refined the technique, standardizing the dimensions and fit, creating wedges that could be installed quickly and reliably. Soldiers whose rifles had suffered from sight wobble brought their weapons in for modification, and the results were immediate and dramatic. Marksmanship scores in live-fire drills increased measurably. Soldiers who had struggled to hit targets beyond 400 meters were now registering consistent hits at 600 meters and beyond. The modification was so effective that it caught the attention of divisional leadership, and eventually a formal report was filed with Ordnance Corps evaluators back in the States. Engineers studied the field modification, analyzed the underlying mechanical problem, and by early 1945, a version of Thornton's field fix had been incorporated into updated maintenance protocols for the M1 Garand, addressing a manufacturing defect that had plagued thousands of rifles since the weapon's introduction. But for James Thornton, the real impact of the bent nail trick wasn't measured in improved marksmanship scores or official reports. It was measured in lives saved. Over the following months, as Allied forces pushed deeper into northern Italy and eventually into Austria, Thornton served as a designated marksman in his company, consistently delivering accurate long-range fire that disrupted enemy formations, protected advancing infantry, and eliminated high-value targets. His reputation grew. Soldiers requested to serve in his squad. Officers sought his input on firing positions and engagement ranges. He was promoted to sergeant, leading a small team of sharpshooters who employed the same stabilized sight modification he had pioneered. By the time the war in Europe ended in May 1945, Thornton had logged over 130 confirmed kills, one of the highest totals for any rifleman in his division, and he had trained dozens of other soldiers in long-range shooting techniques that would serve them for the rest of their military careers. Yet despite his success, Thornton never received formal recognition for his innovation. No medals were awarded specifically for the bent nail modification. No commendations appeared in his service record crediting him with solving a widespread equipment problem. In the chaos of war's end, with millions of soldiers returning home and the military bureaucracy focused on demobilization and reduction of forces, Thornton's contribution was quietly absorbed into the broader history of field modifications and unofficial fixes that characterized the American war effort. He mustered out in the fall of 1945, returned to Montana, and resumed his life as a civilian. He took a job at a machine shop, married his high school sweetheart, and started a family. He rarely spoke about the war. When asked at family gatherings or community events, he would mention the places he'd been and the friends he'd made, but he never told the story of the bent nail unless pressed. It seemed too small, too simple, to be worth mentioning. Just a fix for a broken sight. Nothing heroic about that. But the men who had served with him remembered. Sergeant Eddie Caldwell, who survived the war and settled in Texas, would tell the story at veteran gatherings for decades afterward. That crazy bastard Thornton saved our asses with a bent nail and some Montana ingenuity. Never saw anything like it. I watched him drop Germans at ranges that shouldn't have been possible, in conditions that would make most shooters give up. He turned a defective rifle into a precision instrument with a piece of scrap metal and some creative thinking. Other soldiers who had learned the modification from Thornton carried the knowledge forward, teaching it to younger riflemen in post-war National Guard units and reserve formations. The technique became part of the informal oral tradition of American marksmanship, passed along through generations of shooters who valued practical solutions over doctrinal purity. Even as the M1 Garand was eventually replaced by the M14 and then the M16, the lesson remained. Sometimes the best innovations come not from engineers in laboratories, but from soldiers in the field who refuse to accept limitations. In the decades after the war, military historians occasionally stumbled across references to field modifications involving site stabilization during the Italian campaign, but few connected those references to a specific individual. Thornton's name appeared in unit records. His marksman scores were documented. After-action reports mention effective long-range rifle fire during specific engagements, but the story of how he achieved those scores remained buried in the memories of aging veterans. It wasn't until the early 2000s, when a historian researching small arms modifications during World War II interviewed surviving members of the 92nd Infantry Division, that the full story began to emerge. One of those interviews was with Eddie Caldwell, then in his 80s and living in a retirement community outside San Antonio, who recalled in vivid detail the night Thornton had shown him the bent nail and the subsequent offensive action where Thornton's shooting had turned the tide of battle. Caldwell's testimony, corroborated by other veterans and cross-referenced with after-action reports from October 1944, finally brought Thornton's innovation into the historical record. James Thornton passed away in 1998 at the age of 76 in the same Montana town where he'd been born. He had worked as a machinist for 30 years, raised 3 children, served on a town council, coached youth baseball, and lived a quiet, unremarkable life by most measures. His obituary in the local newspaper mentioned his military service, but offered no details about his wartime exploits. His children knew he'd been a good shot, knew he'd served in Italy, but they didn't know about the bent nail, the night siege, or the lives saved by his improvised fix. It wasn't until years after his death, when a historian's research was published in a military history journal and later picked up by a popular history magazine, that Thornton's family learned the full extent of his contribution. His daughter, Rebecca, now in her 60s and working as a librarian in Billings, read the account with tears streaming down her face. He never told us, she said in a later interview with the magazine. He never said a word about any of it. That was just like him. Fix the problem. Move on. Don't make a fuss. I think he genuinely didn't see it as anything special. To him, it was just common sense. The bent nail trick stands as a testament to a particular kind of heroism, one that doesn't announce itself with grand gestures or dramatic sacrifices, but quietly solves problems and saves lives through practical ingenuity. In an era of modern warfare dominated by advanced optics, computerized targeting systems, laser rangefinders, and precision-guided munitions, the image of a rifleman stabilizing his sight with a bent nail seems almost quaint, a relic from a simpler time when soldiers carried bolt-action rifles and navigated by compass and map. But the principle underlying Thornton's innovation remains as relevant today as it was in 1944. The willingness to challenge accepted limitations, to question doctrine when it fails to serve the mission, and to trust one's own judgment even when official channels offer no support. That mindset, that refusal to accept mediocrity or resign oneself to failure, is what transforms ordinary soldiers into extraordinary problem solvers. The legacy of James Thornton's bent nail extends beyond the specific technical fix he devised. It represents a broader truth about military innovation, that the men and women closest to the problem are often best positioned to solve it, and that bureaucratic systems, no matter how well-intentioned, cannot anticipate every challenge that arises in the chaos of combat. Thornton didn't wait for Ordnance Corps engineers to redesign the M1 Garand site assembly. He didn't file formal complaints through channels or wait for replacement parts that might never arrive. He found a piece of scrap metal, bent it to fit, and solved the problem himself. In doing so, he not only improved his own effectiveness as a rifleman, but created a solution that benefited dozens of other soldiers and ultimately influenced official maintenance protocols. That kind of bottom-up innovation, born of necessity and executed with ingenuity, has always been a hallmark of effective military forces, even when it goes unrecognized by official histories. Today, the story of the bent nail trick circulates in military marksmanship communities, often shared as an example of field expedient problem solving. Instructors at sniper schools and marksmanship training courses sometimes reference Thornton's modification when teaching students about the importance of equipment reliability and the value of understanding the mechanical principles underlying their weapons. The specific technique itself is no longer relevant, modern rifles having long since addressed the sight stability issues that plague the M1 Garand, but the broader lesson endures. Know your equipment, understand its limitations, and be prepared to improvise solutions when necessary. That lesson, perhaps more than any individual technical innovation, is James Thornton's true legacy. On a ridgeline in northern Italy, on a freezing night in October 1944, a young rifleman from Montana took a bent nail and turned a flawed rifle into a precision instrument. He did it not for glory or recognition, but because the mission demanded it, and because his upbringing had taught him that when something is broken, you fix it. In the process, he saved lives, improved the effectiveness of his unit, and demonstrated a kind of quiet heroism that often goes unnoticed in the grand narratives of war. No monuments bear his name. No medals hang in museums commemorating his innovation. But among those who study military history, who value the stories of ordinary men doing extraordinary things, James Thornton and his bent nail trick remain a powerful reminder that sometimes the most important innovations are the simplest, and sometimes the greatest heroes are the ones who never sought recognition in the first place.